So, there we go. So what does the acronym ISO stand for? It stands for the International Organization of Standardization, and it is a global organization that works at standardization across an array of products, not just banking, could be retail services and any other products, as well as standardization across companies. The sequencing and all the way the standard naming ISO 20022 is based on several series of standards that the International Organization of Standardization have put together. This is their latest standards with regards, as I've said, to both products, banking, and a couple of companies. The aim of this organization is to ensure that that it facilitates trade in particular, and also to improve processing, safety of transaction, as well as equality in several areas of the products and services that are being offered across geographies and across multiple countries. So it is an international standard that is worldwide. Now, SWIFT then adopted these standards for their own message types. And in adopting the standard, it then enables SWIFT to provide richer data in our payment instructions. It gives us the ability to have better structuring of our payment instructions. We'll look quickly at what that means in terms of payment instructions. It allows us to have a more granular data that is provided end-to-end in terms of when we carry out a payment. We will be aware that in the last couple of years, both us as a South African market, together with guided by the SARB and the FIC, have been looking at how we tighten our AML laws, our anti-money laundering laws as well. And as part of this data enrichment, we are now able to provide fields for information that we can validate for client payments. We are now have the ability to ask for clients to provide us a lot more information about the beneficiaries and where the money is going, which was somehow limited in the old messages. It allows us to be able to screen the messages better as more data is provided. And it also gives us as banking and as companies the ability to utilize that data in improving how we process our payment, use the data in terms of analytics and data intelligence. So this message type really gives us a better enrichment in that sense of messages. It does also mean that as we get the message bigger and better, there will be additional information that is now required by our customers who are now sending instructions using these message types. And therefore, there is enrichment that will be required in terms of data and information provided to complete this type of transaction going forward. So I've mentioned this started off we went live this year in September as the South African market, where the SARB guided us and said it wanted to be a front runner in implementing these standards. It made a call that in September, all South African banks that interact with the SARB will become ISO compliant, which means within the industry and within banks, we send each other ISO messages. So banks had to do a lot of work and enablement to be able to send these to one another, as well as to the SARB, the SARS, as some of the National Treasury departments that deal with payments. So we all together went live on the 19th of September with all sending each other ISO messages in terms of the old MT type messages that we used to send one another. But having noticed this, and I said that SA went live, the SWIFT community as a whole, the international community, has a timeline of till 2025, where we are looking at being compliant as not just South African banks now. We will also have international banks starting to share ISO messages amongst us as a means of communication that will change. We also have clients who themselves have enabled themselves for SWIFT and therefore are sending SWIFT messages directly to the banks. And those clients will have to go through a process and a phase of also updating their message types to ISO. And this is all happening over a period of time. And we have the timelines of up to the end of 2025 for all these components to be able to be compliant and to make the changes. Having said that, it was important that we as bank get this right first before our clients would get it right. And so SA has gone through that learning. Next year, March, we're going to have the broader international community joining us with these standards, which means it won't just be domestic payments that we facilitate in ISO. It will now be all cross-border payments as well will be included in that batch of payments. And where are our clients sitting? At this point in time, the changes focus on banks, and we will then be journeying with the clients next year to advise on what the actual changes will be from their side, what they may have to change on their ERP systems, firstly, based on the standards we have today, and secondly, based on the learnings that we are seeing. And just to reiterate that if clients who are currently SWIFT members have their own big codes, they have up until 2025 to comply. We will journey with all the clients who will support you and guide you along the way. So quickly, what is the fundamental change between what we used to know as the MT message types and now the new ISO equivalent of those messages? So if you know the SWIFT world, that even the naming of the messages, the series, the 1, 2, 3, were all created to be able to identify what type of message you send in. That logic still remains in ISO. It is probably more simplified in the ISO standards. And it's a language you just got to have to learn with time, right? So what we used to know as payment messages in the past, the 100 series messages, are in the new ISO language called pain, not necessarily to inflict pain, but the pain in front stands for a payment initiating message. So that's where the acronym PAIN comes from a payment initiation message. And of course, it still carries a series behind it to differentiate between the different variants of that initiation messages. The 202s are now called PAX messages. These are cash management messages, or payment cash management messages, because they deal with the movement of funds. And now they are called the PAX messages. We've got our statements and our information notifications. They used to be in the 900 range, predominantly MT900. We are now calling them in the ISO language the CEMT message, the cash management message. These are notifications for intraday, end of day, and notifications of credit and debits and so forth. So they all fit in that category of cash management messages, CEMT messages, and so, yeah. Oh, okay, but I heard. So that's basically the big difference between the messages, the MT messages that we used to, and the new ISO messages in terms of how they are named. They are also a lot more flexible. The language is different. In terms of ISO, we're now using the XML language type, which means the message is much longer. And Chandra will touch on a bit of this in the next slides when he talks through it. As I said, the intention is to be able to get more data, to enrich the payment process, and to improve our SDP as well. So this is really the fundamentals of the shift that we've gone through as a country. I'm going to hand over to Chandra to now take us through the journey that we have walked through ISO and its standards going forward. Thanks, Chandra.
Thanks, Nombasa, and welcome once again to everyone on the line. I have just four slides that I'll be going through, and we'll just focus on these key areas. The first is really just around a recap around the SAMOS ISO change, and this is our domestic RTGS that went live. We'll just look at a quick potential impact to our clients and how did that roll out, how did that transpire, how did that end up in terms of from a delivery side this year. And I'll talk about it from an industry-wide point of view, not just from a Standard Bank aspect. We'll look at what's still to come in 2022, well, what was scheduled to have happened in 2022, and more specifically, what is actually going to be transpiring and planned for 2023 and beyond. As Nombasa mentioned, this journey runs into 2025 worldwide. And finally, we'll just then touch on some of the opportunities that this change around ISO 222, what does that mean? How can that, what could that potentially unlock as some of the value adds, not just for financial institutions, also in terms of the client base that we work with and support through this particular journey. So with that, we'll just jump into the first slide. So 6th of September 1982. So what's so significant about that particular date? Well, that was the date that SWIFT, the very first SWIFT message, ran through the systems in South Africa. 6th of September 1982. That's when the concept around empty messages, the 103s, the 202s that you heard on the previous slides, became a reality in South Africa in our domestic environment. So that's been the language that we've been using quite as a natural language whenever we've been communicating, not just internally in an organization, across with our respective financial institutions, also with our clients. Our clients that we work with have become very much technically driven as well in terms of using terminology and using the words of, can you send me a copy of the 103, a 202, etc. So that's become really embedded in terms of the way we've been working in South Africa particularly. So this has been a 40-year journey, a journey that has been, we've utilized and we've entrenched all of these messages into the way we work, into our systems, into our processes. Every single thing that we look at, we've really looked entrenched that over these 40 years. And September this year was the date that we went live with the new format messages, as Nombasa has mentioned on the previous slides. So it was a language that came about on the 19th of September that at first was quite difficult, daunting. It was very different to the way that we had been experiencing. The language that we spoke about, the message construct of how we looked at information, these two message types were very, very different in their look and feel. So there was a massive learning across the entire industry leading up to this moment in September of changing systems, changing processes, changing the way we utilize these messages in essence. What did a PAX message mean? What did a PEN message mean? What does a CAMP message mean? How do we utilize that and actually deal our internal businesses? It's quite interesting to note that individuals that have been joining the financial industry, this becomes their reality in terms of PAX and PENs and camps and so forth. The empty world will disappear very, very quickly for those individuals because it will become, that has been a 40-year journey, as I said, for most people in these organizations. So a new language, and with the new language and the new construct came a interpretation across the board in terms of how financial institutions looked at these messages and adopted it and internalized this into the various systems. And that did pose challenges, certainly did in the South African industry, and it will pose challenge in any industry that is going to be transforming into this new language set. And unfortunately, especially over the first 2 weeks of going live in September, we need to acknowledge the impact that it had, not just internally into the organization, externally with other financial institutions and our client base as a whole. And once again, this is not just from a Standard Bank point of view, this is an industry as a whole, that these concerns or items that were raised and these challenges that we experienced. So we had time to adopt the original standard of ISO, of MT messages. And we had time to adapt to that message construct. We had 40 years where we've tweaked, changed, and ensured that our STP, our straight-through processing flows, worked as per how we wanted that to operate in our organizations. So when this new language came about, based on some of the assumptions that we had made as a collective, as an industry collective, in the way we should be operating, it unfortunately had an impact. So tweaks that were done over the years for specific clients, for specific FIs, for internal processes, those did not work the way that they worked previously. And it was the same message that we see and hear across the industry in terms of various banks in the South African domestic market experiencing different versions of this. And the extent obviously depends on volume that comes through your organization, as well as how you're geared up for your STP process. If you're highly automated, highly reliant on data coming in and messaging coming in that is in a very particular format, if that does not work, you will end up in issues within the system. So we were caught out as a financial industry locally in South Africa. We were certainly caught out, and it took us a while to get over this, to really start to understand, progress, make some changes, both internally as individual organizations as well as collectively as an industry, and agree on how we should be adopting and changing these to ensure that our STP rates came back to where it was, if not trying to better and improve that, given that we now have a different message construct that's in place. So we've got to acknowledge as Standard Bank, we've got to acknowledge as a South African industry, we've got to acknowledge as across the whole SAMOS program that there was impact on the clients that we service in this domestic market. And that is something that we're going to have to take with us into the next journey in terms of how do we ensure that we can minimize that impact in the subsequent phases, which I'll talk about next. So what was some of the key challenges that we faced or resulted in these internal breaks across the industry, and more specifically in Standard Bank itself? The first one was around the data quality. Having data or having messages being sent to Standard Bank and information missing is one aspect. If the information is missing, there's nothing one can do with it. Having information sent through where fields are populated is the second part. However, the quality thereof also has an impact. And it was one of the key things that we found was that the lack of data or the quality of data had a significant impact on our systems. As I said, particularly from straight-through processing, in terms of affecting the automation that we had in play. And we had to rely and step back in terms of saying, how do we deal this? And the only way we could really deal it initially was through a manual process. And that had an impact in delays across the board with regards to the client base that we had in play, until we got to a point where we could implement changes and rectify those and cater for the data quality that's coming through. So from a data side, the next part that it then leads into is really the structured information. ISO 2822 is based very much on structured formats. And in particular, one of the key things was around address details. In the past, we could have address details sent through us in a particular manner. We would deal that and we would internalize it and process it. With the new ISO 2822 standards, the requirement is that a number of informational fields have to be sent through and effectively transferred from financial institution to financial institution in a very structured format. If that is not in play, it does and has had an impact in our systems. Once again, that consequence of that has been manual processing. And with that, we know, comes errors, and with that comes delays to our clients. So the second part around that was really around the structured information. The third component was around additional validations that we now had to have in place. So having the right data, having the right quality of data, having it in the right structure didn't guarantee that this would work automatically. There were also certain validations that were in place to ensure that the way the message in terms of a 103, 202, now a PAX 8, PAX 9 Cubs, etc., were structured correctly, had the right quality of data. There were certain validations that were in place. And this then also exposed other issues that we had in place. Now, this is not just information entering into the bank. This is also information that we sent out from the bank. If we had made a mistake in terms of our data quality, our structured information, had not applied the right validation rules to certain fields, if those messages left our bank to another local bank, it would have the same impact in those organizations. And what transpired out of this was post the go live of September was a daily industry-wide discussion where we looked at the data quality and we held each other accountable in terms of if we were seeing information being passed between financial institutions that was not of the right quality or even populated, structured correctly, or if there was we could see lack of validation was happening because of manual capturing, we held each other accountable around this. So that has been running and has been running since the 19th of September. That has now really reduced in its frequency to once a week, with next week being the last week that we will be meeting as an industry to talk about these items. And that obviously led to certain discussions at an industry level in how do we adopt and adapt to certain things that maybe it has to be an industry discussion as opposed to an individual bank conversation. As mentioned, we need to accept as Standard Bank our part in the impact it had on our client base across the board. So then what then of the roadmap for 2022 and 2023? So CBPR Plus was and is the component that is around the cross-border aspect around ISO 222. So in South Africa, we had adopted the domestic ISO 222 program. So domestically for RAND, we are now fully 100% compliant around ISO 222. All our messages around payments and settlements are now flowing in that regard. The next phase was cross-border. So anything entering into South Africa, anything entering cross-border on any financial institution that is within the SWIFT network. That change was scheduled for November 21st, 2022. Unfortunately, it did not happen. On the request of the European Central Bank and its members, the ask was to shift this into March 2023, which the international body, as well as all participants within the SWIFT network, have agreed to that date. So that is the next one that's now in play, the CBPR Plus, which affects every single financial institution in the world that is on the SWIFT network, that is passing information to another financial institution in a different jurisdiction, a different country. If you are sending information within your own construct, it doesn't apply. As long as you send a message cross-border, you have to now abide by the new standards in terms of CBPR Plus. And I'll get to the next part, because this, as I said, is a journey leading into 2025. There's we can go back, please, Nabasa. The second part that lands into 2023 and spans across the entire year in different pockets across the year. Central banks across the continent have also decided to ensure that the domestic RTGS is also amended and changed to the new ISO standards. Standard Bank, having a presence across the continent, we are impacted by this change, starting from Q1 next year, all the way into Q4. of 2023 and potentially beyond, depending on how the central banks play out their timelines. So this implies what we went through in South Africa around our domestic RTGS of implementing an ISO 222 standard. Every single one of the countries on the continent is going to go through that same process. We have presence in the bulk of those countries. We will be impacted, and our client base, the FIs that we deal with, similarly, we need to manage that expectation with those individuals. To add to that is the SADC RTGS, which has been scheduled for October 2023. Now, this is the SADC countries within the larger aspect of the continent itself. So the sub-Saharan in essence. Once again, as Standard Bank, we have presence in the SADC region. We will be impacted by those countries that are now adopting this new standard within a localized domestic RTGS. Given the fact that the SADC RTGS environment utilizes RAND, it is a copy of the SAMOS environment that also transitions into the new standard as of October. We are trying to lobby the various groups, lobby the central banks, central bank governors, through our internal teams and appointed representatives to see if we can shift the date out. Having cross-border international CBPR Plus going live in March, having the domestic RTGSs of every single country on the continent shifting in 2023, and adding in a regional change on top of that, countries are either going to have at the very least one, if not three, changes this year in 2023, and that we think is a rather tough ask for those various areas. The ISO standard that's in place does not force you from sending out an ISO formatted message. One has to accept an ISO message if you will receive it. That is the key component, which implies that up to 2025, any financial institution that's on the SWIFT network must be able to receive an ISO formatted message and can send an either an ISO formatted message or a traditional empty message out the door up to November 2025. So every single financial institution and Standard Bank as a group will have to live in this dual world until 2025, where we will have to accept ISO messages as well as accept empty messages and send either a combination of ISO or empty messages, depending on where we are. So that is really the challenge that every single financial institution plugged into the SWIFT network will face from now all the way into 2025. So then if we look at the final step in terms of what are the opportunities. So we go to the next and final slide, please, Nambasa. There's a couple of things that we can really look at that really opens up opportunities, and it is really going to be up to individual banks, clients, business units within organizations to look at this new construct and determine how one can leverage off this. What are the opportunities around it? And I'll name a couple of these items that we believe are things that we should be looking at. So the first one is around enhanced data and information. As I mentioned, if you look at the traditional ISO 103, about an empty 103 message, and if you look at a PAX 8 message as an example, very, very different in the way the construct of those messages look. The same data that is sitting in a 103 can be replicated directly and populated into a PAX 8 message. However, there are additional fields that one can utilize to carry an additional part of the payload. So you now have the ability to have enhanced data within the same message that one can then look at how can we utilize this within an organization, within a group, within a region, as I mentioned, like SADC RTGS, within a domestic nature, as well as obviously across the continent. We now have longer fields that we can carry longer sets of information, where we may have been restricted in a value being 10 characters as an example. We now can carry 35 characters. So it opens up those possibilities in in essence. This is now the universal standard. In everything that we do, everything that we adopt, this is the standard that we will be operating in going forward. And with that, we can look at how do we leverage off it? How do we leverage off the fact that regardless of who we talk to, what system we integrate with, which platform that we might want to utilize, we now have this standard that we can utilize. Given that we have this enhanced data, we have additional information we can carry, as well as this universal platform. What then does it mean for our straight-through processing, an ability to be able to process things without human touch around it? And this is really where the key focus is going to be. We've spent 40 years, as I said, adopting and adapting the MT message formats. We've now on this journey of really doing this with the ISO messages. And this will play out as we kind of go through this. And STP can only really lead to benefit to our clients in quicker turnaround times. As I said, less manual intervention, fewer mistakes around these things. And that's really going to be the focus that we'll be looking at. Closed user groups are, in essence, where you can look at so SADC RTGS, as an example, is a closed user group. You have to be a participant to play in that space. And given the fact that you are a participant in that area, you can tweak the message construct for that particular region. So this is where the closed user groups come into play, is that the view is to adopt the universal standard as a first part of the message, and then add on to it anything that you want to be bespoke around these specific user groups. So you might find the European domestic messages would have a tag on. Our SADC RTGS environment would have a tag on. Our SAMOS environment could have a tag on to a normal universal standard. So the first part is always universal, and you can add to it, as long as you are within this particular user group. And that really then opens up interoperability. Now, interoperability in terms of various platforms. If you look at the drive in terms of central banks adopting and looking at and experimenting with central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, the platform now doesn't matter. If I have a universal standard and I'm carrying a payload, how then can I integrate with those platforms? How can I leverage off those platforms? How do I get cryptocurrencies, as an example, to form part of this, so that our fiat currencies that we are running, our cryptocurrencies, our central bank digital currencies, all of these can actually interact with each other, because our message construct now can become universal. The platform doesn't matter anymore. So how does those platforms adopt and utilize these messages? And that's one of the key things that you'll find is a big driver that's happening at the moment, particularly around central bank digital currencies. And how then do we utilize elements around things like blockchain technology, using the technology around blockchain, as well as looking at things around our digital recons and the like. So this really then opens up the market to additional participants that may not be seen as traditional financial institutions, that can now start to play in this world, create services that can interact with the SWIFT network. And that is the vision of where this is moving towards. There are opportunities. It's about how do we look at this information? How do we look at this construct? And what is it that we want to do around it, both as a financial institution, as a business, as a client, as a correspondent bank that we might be working with? How can we look at this holistically to see what can we leverage from it, so that we can ensure that the flow of information happens in a manner that really benefits our clients across the board, regardless of segment in our various markets. And with that, I'll hand over to Nombasa.
Thanks, Chandra, for those insights and for sharing. So where we're going to go into now is we're going to an open session of Q&A, as well as any, considerations, views from clients that we as a bank need to consider. Also, we are open to receive feedback on how the changes have impacted your environment, and how can we better improve that process and that impact going forward. So we will just open up the floor for comments and questions and anything for considerations. We are here to listen, and we will do our best to be able to provide insights and guidance where we can. We also look forward to receiving feedback and how we can improve on what we do and the impacts that we have on the customers. So with that in mind, we're going to now open up for a Q&A session.
I do have this under here from Morgan Stanley. I do have one quick question. So regarding the on backslide and backslide messages, the truncation scenarios, did you guys get a chance on that?
Yes, it was one of the big challenges that we had was based on your financial institution. Systems are geared up in a particular way, right, to deal the MT103s, 202s, and over time, as I said, 40 years or more, depending on institutions and depending on which environment you're in, systems will be geared up to say, well, I'm expecting to have 16 characters as an example, and all of a sudden you were given 35. Yeah. And so what do you do as a financial institution? Do you simply truncate it and carry that through your system, and then you lose, potentially lose the referencing aspect around it? Or how do you start to store this information in a manner that you can leverage and you can get back to it? So that is definitely a consideration and something that really affected the industry as a whole, in terms of starting to see message lengths that were even longer than 35 characters coming in, even though the standard said 35. So bear in mind, even though the ISO standard says 35 characters, the payload will carry more in that regard. So there's no swift validation that says it can only be 35 characters in the network. It's up to the institution to be able to do that. So yes, you are going to run into that where financial institutions may send you longer than 35 characters as an example, because they're not formatting the message correctly in that structured format. They're still adopting the one line as an example and running the entire 4 lines into one line. You might end up in that scenario. So it is really something to bear in mind and understand how are you gonna deal this internally.
Okay. And second question on the CAMT 53, 940, 950. So I see there are some of the tags are missing. Like on MT 940, 950, there's a tag 60, 61, and 86. So while in CAMT 53, those those tags are not available, as per my knowledge. Yeah. Do you have any?
Unfortunately not. I'm not too close to the details itself. All I can do is refer you back to the SWIFT standards, or rather the book that's on the swift.com itself. So unfortunately, I don't have the knowledge to answer that particular question itself. Okay. The statements are still in flux at the moment. You'll find that a number of organizations are working on a bilateral basis to say, do we transition to the new standard or do we stick to the existing one? And for the most part, I think financial institutions are sticking to the existing formats as opposed to transitioning to the new formats. And that can be done on a bilateral basis.
Okay, all right. Okay. Can I get some contact reference so that I can reach out for any testing purpose from MS to SE? Standard Bank.
You want a Standard Bank contact person to reach out to?
For testing, to do the testing.
Testing is done on a appointed test partner. You're talking about from a CBPR Plus point of view?
Yep.
Okay. So the thing is, you need to figure out who is your appointed test partner. You should have a appointed test partner for the testing coming up. It may not necessarily be Standard Bank. I'm not sure.
Okay. Thank you.
If it is Standard Bank, you should be able to reach out through the through those published lists that will then be available.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, Chandra, it's Rick here. Maybe just to add to that, sorry, the client that has just spoken can also reach out to us in account management. From Morgan Stanley, we'll get the list, and I'm sure the email address will be there as well. And we can assist and facilitate the relevant contact. I'm sorry, let me put my camera on.
Sure.
Is that the gentleman from Morgan Stanley?
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Rick.
I will drop my email address in the chat, and please feel free just to send me your details, and I will connect you and assist.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Any other thoughts, questions on the line?
Nabasha, if I may ask a question, maybe this is to Sean. Given Sean, if I understood correctly, your mandate was kind of across a group in terms of landing the ISO program. Is there anything that you've seen now that is of any concern to you, or something that you may not have been aware of before?
Globally, or as in what you're doing within
Globally.
South Africa? Other than the multiple events at the same time, I would say no at this moment. I mean, thankfully, we're seeing a lot of conversation between SWIFT and the central banks where we operate. I think no concern, but a personal view is about the coexistence period, and will smaller houses actually be able to be fully ISO by 2025 would be the one I'd keep an eye on, I would say. But otherwise, Chandra, I've not seen anything that concerns us. We were ready to go in November to share with you. So we clearing chaps, Target, Ritz as well in Australia. So we were good to go. So I was quite disappointed personally to see the setback, but no, nothing of a concern.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, similarly on our side, and I suppose that delay now means holding your environment in some way, which creates delays on other projects that you may have on the back of it. So I think that's been one of the key concerns that we've had.
Yeah, I think the other thing for me that potentially is a slight concern is testing, because you have no data. As you said, where we've been in SWIFT for so long, you can always replay a day's data, you can test what you've done, but because everything is new, and people are mocking up test messages, I think it's just going to be in a hunker down mode till we finally start seeing it in anger.
And that's certainly played out in the South African domestic market. Exactly that point. It wasn't as though we could take a full month's worth of data, let alone a full day's worth of data, and run that through our systems, because we didn't have any of that stuff. So yes, we had to manufacture it. And as an industry, we really worked hard to try and do, to actually run the test cases through, having test partners tracking these type of things. And yes, it still came up at the end of the day where we started to see on day one, first 2 weeks in essence, use cases and information that we just need not think about or look at. Particularly the one that caught us out was where foreign banks were sending rand payments into South Africa, and given that there's a 103 coming in, the ability to be able to take that in certain fields that had the A option, D option as an example, that was not something that we could deal with, because now you have missing information, you have light information coming in, and you have to add to it. Where do you add from? And that was one of the ones, the key one that we had, was because we acted as the intermediary. And if you are an intermediary, I think that's where the bigger challenge is, because you might want to have to send out information, and it's like, where do I get the information from?
Yeah, totally agree. And what I'd say to you, I could quite happily talk to you for hours about the journey we've been through. And I'm thinking, if you wanted to reach out, do that. Just reach out privately.
I'd appreciate
More than happy
that.
to sit and we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
A virtual hug, probably, just to share the pain we've been through. More than happy to do that.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for that.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Chandra. I don't see any hands in the room. And then, as Sean said, the conversation doesn't stop. This is just an introduction. We will be talking about ISO for quite a long time, especially as we prepare for 2025. So this was just an opportunity for us to start the conversation. We definitely will have more sessions as we begin the new year, and as we throughout the year to keep connected on what the changes are and how we are learning from this process as it is new for all of us. And so I want to take the opportunity to thank all of you for joining this call, and hopefully we can continue some of the conversations offline. And those who are going on a festive break, I wish you all a safe festive season. Be safe, take care, and hope to see you again as we continue the conversations in the new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nombasa. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.